welcome back to the American English Podcast. Today is going to be a bit of a story time, kind of about my life, like a show and tell kind of thing without, showing anything, but, let's just get into it. So I'm going to tell you from the beginning about my life in Canada in an immigrant family. So as you guys may know, I am Canadian born, which means I'm Canadian, right? It should. But when you get to a place like Canada and you call yourself a Canadian, it doesn't always go over as smoothly as you would hope. Like, since my specific area has a lot of Indigenous people, calling yourself a Canadian there is like you're stealing our title, you're stealing our name, you're in a place that you don't belong, this is our land, like get out. It's kind of hostile, honestly, and at least in my area. It's not nice at all. Here and there you might find some that you get along with, but they're typically, at least towards me personally, in my experience, it has been like a malicious nature. So that's why I don't call myself Canadian, just to avoid that. So when I am home, and people usually ask like, oh, so where are you from? Like, it's a very normal question, even though sometimes maybe it shouldn't be. I usually have to explain myself, because the times that I have said I'm Canadian, it doesn't go over well. They're like, oh, so like you're Indigenous then? And I'm like, no, I'm not Métis, I'm not Indigenous at all. I was just born in this country. So then they're like, oh, so you're not Canadian? And I'm like, okay, well, my mother is Brazilian, my father is from a small island called Mauritius, that's part of the African continent, and my grandparents are from Portugal on my mother's side, if that helps you figure out my ethnicity at all. They're like, oh, okay, that makes more sense. So what do you consider yourself more of? Like, are you more African? Are you more Portuguese? And I'm like thinking, how on earth do we qualify that? Like, how can we decide how much of something that we are and that we're not? This is like a situation I think a lot of mixed kids get into, especially in North America, when they try to ask us what we are and they want one solid answer, and then we can't really give it to them. Because we're literally half-half. Like, I don't know what to say. So I'm more white than black, or I'm more black than white. I don't know, man. I'm just me. Like my fiance says, I'm freaking colorless. Like, it's such a ridiculous topic to be on about. But when you're a child especially, this is something that can pester you. And it brought a lot of, conflict in friendships for me. When you're a child, obviously children have a different mentality and they ask silly things that they might think are appropriate, but they aren't. And sometimes it can come off as innocent, and sometimes it can come off as not so nice intentionally. So my biggest thing was, I grew up with the Portuguese side. Like, I spoke Portuguese at home. We ate Portuguese food. We ate Brazilian food. I was raised with the Portuguese Brazilian Catholic culture. Like, that's how I was as a person. Of course, I was influenced by the outside world of Canada, but my mother really sheltered me when I was younger. So I didn't have any friends that weren't Portuguese. I didn't hang out with anyone that wasn't in my family. I wouldn't really go out in the world to talk to other kids because my mother wouldn't want me to. She would say, like, they might not be nice to you. I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you speaking to somebody with a bad influence. So I'm only going to give you to people that I trust and I know from like the Portuguese church or our Portuguese community. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I also got to know some Ukrainians and Polish people from our neighborhood, which were also really sweet people, and some Italians, and that was amazing. But then, when I really stepped into the school that I would go to for 8 years, that school is where I had some problems, because the school, first of all, was French. So me going from speaking Portuguese all the time, listening to it all the time, only listening to English when I go outside the house in the car, or when I listen to the TV, that was kind of hard to not be speaking English or Portuguese. English, what I've already heard and started to understand but didn't really speak, and Portuguese, which I knew really well. So going to speak French now, I didn't know what to do. Thank God I had a translator that was a family friend from the church. That's a really sweet woman. She did help me a lot in those early stages of school because I didn't know how to say I had to go to the bathroom, or how to say like that I was hungry or that I needed my mom or something. So when the teacher, I think it's really on the teacher's part too to be very understanding of the cultural community of the children that she's teaching, because when she would say something in French, since it was an immersion school, she expected us to understand, and I really didn't understand almost anything. And then she would explain it in English. And you think I would understand it in English? Like, no, I didn't know either. So I was just there like, I don't know. And then she would yell at me because she would think I'm just being like a brat or like doing it on purpose to act out. And like, that wasn't what was happening. I just couldn't understand. So then I would go ask the translator, the family friend, to help me, and she would explain what was going on, and I'd be like, okay, I understand now. So that was really helpful. I also had her in grade 1, so that helped me learn a lot more of what was going on. So by, I think, grade 1, grade 2, I started to understand the French. But it was hard to pronounce for me as well. Like, my Portuguese pronunciation, since that was the first language I did learn, goes into every other language. Because I have practiced English so much, it's gone from my English, thankfully. But in French, I can definitely hear it because I need to practice my French pronunciation more, but that's something they didn't really focus on in the school. So they focused on the grammar, of course, just being able to speak fluidly, to be able to speak all the time without fear, but I confused the languages so much. Like, like if there was a word I didn't know in French or couldn't remember, I would say it in Portuguese, and odds are it was not the same. So in those instances, I was like, dead. I didn't know. And then the teacher would be like, how do you not know? And I'd be like, I just don't remember. I know it in Portuguese. And they're like, okay, so I'll explain it to you so that you understand. And then they explained it in French. Sometimes I understood, sometimes not. Then they explained it in English. And sometimes with the English that I knew, I was like, okay, this makes sense. So as I went on, I started to listen to more music, more radio, more TV, and speak to the friends at the school who spoke English. So thankfully, with them, I was able to learn the language more in the games that we played, in the sports, in the English class that we did have about every day or every second day. I was able to catch on a lot more. And what I didn't understand, I would ask, or I would try to explain it in the words I knew, and then I could learn from that. So this is a common thing that goes on with children from immigrant family that are born in Canada or are raised there from about 2, 3 years old, 4 years old. And it's like a struggle, but it's also a blessing, you know? Because on the one hand, it's definitely hard to be able to come from one language and jump into another, but it's very helpful in that it feels more natural later. And on the other hand, you feel like you don't belong because you know nothing of the place that you're in, but on the other hand, you do belong because that's the country you're from or the country that you now live in. So that was always a thing for me. Like, I would always run back to the cultural community I'm familiar with, so I would feel like that was my home, and that's where I felt more comfortable. Which maybe for some of you who haven't experienced life in Canada or maybe even the United States don't understand or don't see yet, but when you get there, I think you'll understand a little bit more. There's a lot of importance on keeping your culture and your ethnicity and your cultural identity. So churches and groups and cultural houses will all have events all the time throughout the week to get their cultural group together. Some stronger than others, of course. Some have been there longer than others. Like, for example, the Ukrainians, the Polish, the Portuguese have been in my area of Canada for a long time. So those communities are very strong. Whereas the Brazilian community, the Mexican community, at least in my area, are much smaller because there aren't as many immigrants. But that's starting to change. We're seeing a lot more immigration, and I think that's a really good thing. So as well as seeing really fluent Canadian-rooted people who have had their families there a long time and know the language well, or come from England or Ireland or even Scotland, there are newer immigrants, so you're going to be hearing a lot of different types of English if you get around there. You're going to be hearing it mixed with other languages, with different speech patterns from other languages, which sometimes is very hard to understand in the case of Mandarin or Hindi, and other times it's really easy to understand in the cases of Spanish or Portuguese, because you already know that language if you know one of those languages. So it's always a battle to try to be really good at the language that's spoken in the country that you're in, but people are also understanding, knowing there's a lot of immigration. So if you get a nice person to talk to, you should be fine. But there are some moments where your English has to be very strong. And those are the moments that segue, we get into when we go into interviews or school applications. If your English isn't top notch, they automatically mark you down, like it's like a goodbye. There's situations where if you want to close a business deal or really be taken seriously in any field, if your English isn't like really, really good, sometimes they don't take you seriously because you can't even speak the language that you're meant to speak in that country right, and they take offense to that. So this is speaking from my own experience, from what I've seen happen, from what's even happened to me. Sometimes if I don't understand some of the idioms that they say, which I have to ask, I'm like, oh, I haven't heard this one before. It's kind of old. Can you explain it to me? And then if they're nice, they explain. And if they think I should already know because I live in Canada and I'm Canadian, then they will just be really rude about it. So I can say sometimes it's a dog-eat-dog world, and sometimes it's a loving kumbaya community. I was also lucky enough to be in a province where they speak a lot of French, so I was able to learn French well in that school I was in, as well as out in the real world. So there's a lot of different types of French, if you don't know. There's the Canadian Quebecois version, which is kind of what we hear in my province. And there's also the France French, which is different from the Parisian French, which is different from the French from Haiti and the French from every other African country. So it's all the same base, but the accents and the dialects are different. The slang is different. So it's definitely a learning curve to be able to learn all of them. Kind of like learning the different accents of Spanish. But one thing I can say is going into an immersion school of a language that is not around you all the time is kind of difficult, because I would then, at the time that I graduated from that school, know a lot of words and technical things in the French language. But then when I was speaking to an English person or in an English area, I would no longer know the English word for that. I would just not remember, or maybe I wasn't taught it because it wasn't so important as the French. So transitioning into an English school and more an English environment was hard. But again, luckily I was blessed with having a teacher who spoke French and who used to teach French immersion, so he was able to translate a lot of what I knew and explain it in French if I got very lost. So that was also a blessing, not in disguise necessarily, but it was something good that happened in my life. So if you're going to Canada, know where you're going, because most of Canada is pure English. And then you get the odd parts of Manitoba, Quebec, that are definitely French. And if you're not sure about the English that you're going to need when you go to the East Coast, not that it's very popular to go there other than tourism, but on the East Coast, their English is mixed with some of the Irish accent and Scottish accent. They even have some different words for things again. So if you're in Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia area, even Cape Breton, that area speaks a different type of English. Like the English base that you have is good, but the accent is definitely going to throw you off, and you're going to need to listen to a lot of that type of accent. So I shall leave below some examples of it so that you can check it out. I haven't been there personally, so I can't really say, but it's understandable if you already can understand the Irish-Scottish accent from overseas. Let's also go on about the accent in Canada, like Canadian English. So it's based off of British English, but it has changed and merged more with American English. So our accent is basically the same as American, unless you're like very Canadian, which is what I would call the Newfie side, like the East Coast is a little bit different. But the rest of Canada is heavily comparable to the standard American accent. Like from me, normally people think I'm American, but because I don't sound that Canadian over the top, like very redneck or very East Coast, I think it's good to have a very standard accent so people can understand you easily and communicate with you easily. But it's also good to understand for yourself the other accents that you're going to come in front of. And this is more of a type of C2, C1 English problem rather than B2, but if you want to just communicate yourself in intermediate English, it's also very helpful to understand those in which that you will be communicating with. So if you're one of those people who have not yet joined my school, who are just listening to this for free on Spotify, then send me a message on WhatsApp. I always have that linked, and I can tell you about how to study English with me for accents, dialects, just fluid conversation. Everything you're going to need to be able to speak this language confidently and well is what I provide. And that's not tooting my horn too much because it's definitely true, and we got 100% success rate. So if you want to learn English with the coolest teacher around, the coolest cat around, then definitely send me a message. Unless you're already my student, then howdy. How y'all doing? I'll see you later in class. I think another thing I should mention that you probably already know is crossing the border from Canada to America if you're a citizen from either country is very easy. Like, it's a normal thing we always do. So I've been able to visit America a couple times. I haven't seen the whole country, definitely not. But I do see the difference. As soon as you cross that border, it gets very patriotical, like very American, America everywhere, the flags, the people. There's a stereotype that Canadians are very polite and have good manners, and Americans don't. So Americans sometimes can be more straight up than Canadians, and Canadians kind of hide things. I think this is just a stereotype, honestly. Like, I do see some things that they don't always hold the door open, or they don't always say sorry as much as we do. That was definitely true. But of course, this is just my experience. It might be different state to state. For example, people of Toronto are going to be similar to people of New York because they're close by. So that rough attitude definitely crosses over. It's just kind of like in your face. So that scares me, honestly, because I'm not used to that kind of thing. But when it happens, especially from a stranger, like if it's from someone I know, I'm okay. But a stranger, I just want to cry. I'm like, what did I do to you? Yeah, I think I am a very nice person. I'm just very sensitive as well because I'm not used to having so much craziness all the time from a huge city, because my city really isn't that big. Like, if we were to compare it to a Latin American city, it's comparable to Medellin in the size and the time it takes to get from one side to the other by car. Let's go into tourism for a second. Like, what's the most beautiful place in Canada? At least that I've seen, because I've been to the West Coast, not the East. I would say Alberta is the most beautiful because it's got the best of both worlds. It has like rolling hills, but also some mountains, and that's really nice. And a lot of beautiful lakes too. Like, a notable one that Esther loves is Lake Louise. It's really clear turquoise waters with a mountain-esque background. But I haven't seen all of Canada nor all of America, so I can't really tell you all the best tourist destinations just yet. My area, the prairies, which is Manitoba and Saskatchewan, are very plain. A lot of wheat fields, corn fields, sunflower fields. And I think it's beautiful in that way that it's so peaceful and serene, and they also have a lot of lakes. We also have a lot of ranchers and horse farms, stables, dairy farms. So it's kind of a peaceful life in the country. For me, I definitely prefer the countryside, to be living there or even just spending time there, because people are at more of a slow pace. Like, it's much more comfortable, it's peaceful, there's not a lot of noise, it's some good times. Anyway, that's about all that I'm gonna say about tourism, Canada, education. I hope you learned something in this episode of the podcast, and I'll definitely see you in the next episode of the American English Podcast. This is Bella signing off. And toodaloo. Bye.